All right, next up on the podcast, we got Nate Richard. Nate, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you doing, Tom?
I'm good. We got the matching hoodie. We knew the assignment. We got the tech hoodie going, ready to go today.
Exactly. That's how you know it's legit.
um, well, I'm excited to have you on, man. The first thing that came to my mind when I was checking you out on LinkedIn was the college background, pre med. Now like sales leader, been in sales for decades now. My mom was actually the same way. She was a chemistry major, then got into sales, and then later into marketing.
Oh,
So
interesting.
just curious, like before we get into everything else of your career, like walk me through that time period, like doing all the pre-med work, grinding in college, and then somehow making your way into the sales world.
Yeah. So my story into sales is a little bit unorthodox. So I was, like you said, I was doing my undergrad and pre med studies. I had always thought I wanted to go into orthopedic surgery. So that's kind of the track that I was on. And I had one summer, I had a roommate of mine who went and did door to door sales. And he came back, he went to Canada out of all places. And he came back and he made something like 70 or 80K. And at that time, that would have paid for my entire undergrad, paid off my car, had some money left over to have fun. And so I thought, no way. I was like, I don't believe that. I was like, show me your, show me your pay stubs or your bank account. So he ended up showing me. I was like, okay, it checked out. And so right at that time, it was coming up to um, a point where I had to kind of decide, like, what am I going to do to kind of pay for schooling? And, do I go, I'm from Texas originally. So do I fly back to Texas and, take a job there during the summer? Do I work somewhere in Utah where I was going to school? And I ended up just making the decision to try this door to door thing. And I thought, okay, my buddy can do it. And there's a few other guys that are doing it. I'm going to go give it a try. And so I ended up at the time, had hardly any money. I think I had like $1,500 in my account, had this old beat up car that had like 180,000 miles on it. And I even had a dog from like a previous relationship that I was in. And so I like threw everything in the car and packed myself up and drove all the way up into Canada to go work for this small company up there and do door to door sales. And so ended up doing that and having a fairly decent first summer doing that, where I was able to kind of pay everything off. And so it just kind of opened my mind up a little bit to, maybe there's another career pathway here for me that's not what I had originally thought. And so that was kind of the beginning of it.
All right, so I got a few questions for you. One, are you saying that your friend made 70 or 80K in the summer or in the whole year?
Yeah, in the summer. So he went and worked from the end of April, right when the semester was
Yeah.
over, and he got back at the end of August.
Wow. And that's in college.
That was in college, yeah. And so my perception of door to door sales was kind of the stereotypical, like the guys that show up trying to sell the magazines or newspapers,
Yeah.
and or like the cleaning solution, which they always seem to like sucker my dad into buying. Um,
Yeah.
and he was selling home automation and like security systems, and I just didn't know anything about that world at all. And when he introduced it to me, I ended up realizing like there was a lot of guys that were making quite a bit of money doing this. As 100% commission. So if you didn't sell anything, it was pretty high risk. But there was quite a few guys that were doing that in college and were able to kind of pay their way and stay debt free. So it was interesting to me.
That's crazy. What's your so I started similarly. I did Cutco knives in
Okay.
college, which
Yeah.
I think maybe they formerly did door to door. They didn't do that when I was there. It was all cold calling and set up,
Right.
meetings. But always curious, like for the door to door, what's your opener to get people to actually open the door and have a conversation with you?
So at the time, it's all about breaking preoccupation, which I guess you could say is, it carries over into SaaS sales as well, right? Like when you cold call somebody, the main goal is you're trying to break preoccupation and then try to convey something in a really quick period of time that gets their interest or convey some sort of value. And so in door to door selling home automation, we were selling up in these oil towns in northern Alberta. I mean, I'm talking like you drive 12 hours north of the border to before you get to these remote places. And these oil guys were making a ton of money and were buying a whole bunch of toys. They had ATVs and quads, these lifted trucks and everything, but the crime was really high because there wasn't any security providers in that area. And so the pitch was pretty simple. It was, hey, if you stick a sign out in your yard and you advertise for us that we're local and that we're available here, like we'll pay for all of the equipment in the home and install it for you for free. And you just pay a monthly subscription. And so, you do like a lot of name, like once you'd sell one in the neighborhood, you do a lot of name dropping, like, oh yeah, Jerry down the street, like he told me to
Yeah.
swing on by. And people would say like, I'm not interested. You're like, oh, that's exactly why I'm here. And they kind of just look at you like, can you kind of throw them off that way? And so there's some tricks of the trade when you get into door-to-door sales, but yeah, that's where I started, man. Just knocking doors and working at 100% commission job.
That's awesome. And then straight off of that, you obviously knew, hey, this is a great way to make money. I'm good at this. This is something I like. And you went straight into sales right after school. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's funny because I actually wasn't very good at door to door initially. So I went up there and I knocked with my friend for the first day, and he kind of showed me what he was saying and everything. So the next day I went out on my own. I sold two sales, and at the time we were getting paid like $400 or $500 a piece. And so for me as a college kid, like I had never made more than 1,000 in like a week or two. And so
Yeah.
to do it in a day, I was like, oh wow. And I started to kind of do like the mental math of like, okay, if I'm doing 6 days a week out here for 4 months, like what could I pull in? And so I got kind of cocky, and I went like 2 weeks with nothing.
Yeah.
I just bageled every day. And so I kind of went through the whole like, oh man, maybe I'm not really cut out for this. Maybe I can't do this. And like I said before, I didn't really have a lot of money at the time. And so that was kind of shrinking a little bit because you're having to pay for gas every day and pay for your housing and everything. And so I kind of came to this crossroads of like, all right, do I stick this through? Do I try to figure out how to get good at this and kind of eat the humble pie? Or do I decide to kind of tuck my tail between my legs and go back to, getting a campus job or something? And I just thought about it one night. It kind of kept me up real late. And I just decided like, if other people can do it, there's got to be a way I can do it as well. And
Yeah.
so I just got to get like maniacally focused on getting good at this. And so I just made that decision. I called my manager the next day and I said, hey, every time I get rejected or I lose a sale or however it goes, I'm going to call you. Let's role play. I want you to give me feedback on what I'm not saying right or what I'm not doing right. Let me get good at it. And then at night, I get back around 9 or 10 o'clock at night, and I just spend a couple hours every night talking to guys that were doing it well, picking their brains. We had some training material. I'd go read through that every night. And so eventually I started going from zeros every day to maybe one sell a day, and then followed by a couple of zeros. And then it'd be more consistent. It'd be one sell every day. And then it would be eventually maybe one and then two. And then where it kind of turned for me, where I was like, okay, I think there's something in sales for me, is I had a Saturday where I went and I worked for like 10 or 11 hours and I got 6 in one day. And, that was enough to pay off the rest of my car in that one day.
Mm.
And so it just changed my whole paradigm around like where I was going to go in my career. And so I ended up doing this for like another 3 summers. And then at that point is when I kind of transitioned a little bit more and decided to not pursue medical and actually go into more of like the corporate selling.
So what do you think that is? Because that behavior is not normal, right? Like if you're struggling with something, the normal human tendency is probably to say, this might not be for me, or in the best case, like, yeah, I'm gonna ride this out, and like, I had a couple bad days or a couple bad weeks, but I'll get back to normal. And you went into like just like full, just went ham with it, right? Like to call your boss after every time you get rejected, and to do the role play, and to do the materials after work. Like, you've seen enough salespeople, that's not what the average salesperson does. So I'm just curious, like what was driving you at that moment to work that hard, and to focus that hard to be successful?
Yeah, so I all the way back then, I think, anyone who's been in sales for a while knows that it's a mental game. And as a company, we did a lot of training on your mindset
Yeah.
and how to start visualizing success. And I remember there was a training that we did one morning where it was like, hey, if you see a house that's got the evidence of like this person's got money and we know there's crime in the area, you should be thinking and telling yourself like, oh, sweet, this is a sale, it's in the bag, as you're approaching the house. And just thinking that will kind of change your attitude towards what the possible outcome would be. And then secondly, it was like, if other people are doing it, like, why can't you?
Mm.
And so I think it was just a little bit of self-belief. Like I think through high school and stuff, being in sports, I kind of developed that a little bit of like, hey, if you apply yourself and you get focused on something, there's not a lot of people out in the world that can't make something of themselves if they choose to do that. And so I just kind of had a little bit of that personal like self-efficacy, but I definitely went through the doubts and kind of the struggles of like, why can't I do this initially, right? Like there were people, I went like 5 or 6 days straight in that first week with nothing, and there would be guys, selling 3 or 4 a day,
Mm.
and so that was pretty humbling. And I remember my manager just said, look, when you first get in sales, a lot of people think that they're going to be good if they can talk well and they're like social, like they can get along with other people. But there's a whole skill set and a craft you have to go learn and do well at in order to have any success in it. And so he's like, you're just starting. So what you thought you might be, because you got a couple easy wins the first day, he's like, that's probably not what it is. And he was really good at kind of helping, be a support system for me through that. So
Did that, apply once you went into the corporate sales world? Like, were you just light years ahead of people that are just graduating college and have never done it before because of that background?
I think it definitely gave me an edge in terms of being self-reliant,
Hmm.
because for 4 years, I made my money on 100% commission.
Mm.
And so it was all about results. And so at the end of the day, if you didn't find a way to produce, you didn't get paid anything. And so going into SaaS, where typically your half of your compensation is salary, so you could sell zero, maybe not for very long, but technically you can still get paid something. I just had already kind of been wired a little bit differently mentally to be like, okay, I'm not going to succeed unless if I can go produce. So I just kind of brought that mindset in with me when I transitioned.
That's got to be like somewhat freeing in a way, right? That it's kind of like if everything goes to shit with my career, I joined the wrong company early on, or things don't work out, like that's the ultimate, you know, being able to kind of like scrap it out on your own. If you've already proven yourself for 4 years that you can do it, you're only going to make whatever you sell on. Um, in my mind, I feel like that would give me the confidence that, hey, even if things don't work out at this first gig, or I don't perform as well as I'd like, or the company goes under, or whatever, I'm going to be successful and I'm going to figure this out. And I tell as many young people that that are interested in sales, that are in college or high school, or even in another profession, like go do a summer or a year and sell. I say Cutco, but it'd be the same thing as what you're talking about,
Right.
where it's all commission there as well. And so it's like, go see if you like it. And there's some people that love it, and then I see them be CROs, later down the road. And there's some people that hate it, and they're not in sales now, because they
Yeah.
figured out real quick that just wasn't the right job for them.
Yeah, that's really well said. I mean, there's something to be said for going into like a high risk environment and seeing like how can you produce under pressure like that constantly. And it's a skill like anything else, like we're not all inherently born as salespeople. We might be good at talking with people. Some might be more naturally resilient than others, but like these are all skills that are developed over time. And so when you kind of put yourself in a position where every single day you have the risk of failure like that, where if you don't sell, you don't make money, it's unlike any other job, but it also gives an opportunity to whoever's choosing to do that to really build resiliency in a way unlike any other. And then, like you said, that can benefit you in the years to come, because when the going gets tough, you're like, well, I've really kind of been exposed like as bad as it can get. Like I've had several weeks of making $0 after 60-hour work week. So what else could the world throw at me that I couldn't overcome?
Yeah, I think it's just like it's adding on. I talk a lot about on the podcast, like it's important to do hard shit, right? And it could have been that job. It could be, you're into, running marathons or whatever it might be, that just kind of like tells yourself that, you're someone that can handle tough situations. So when you get put in them, you're ready to go.
Yeah,
I'd love to switch gears and talk about the Qualtrics run for a bit, because it's not
sure.
every day you see someone's job. They're somewhere for a few years and went through several funding rounds and then an acquisition and then also an IPO, So I'd love for you to just talk about the run there and what your roles were like during that stretch of your career.
It's called the double dipping strategy, to be acquired and then IPO a few years
Yeah.
later. Yeah, so I went from door to door to working for that same company, but on their corporate office into
Okay.
like more of an inside sales function. And so I did that for nearly 4 years. Went into management. We had a guy from Cisco who also had an MBA at Duke, was like super smart. His name was Scott Hardy. He came in at Vivint as our COO. And then we also had a president at the time named David Bywater, who was also like an ex-Bain consultant, came in. And so once I got into leadership, my vision on like what I wanted to do for my career changed a little bit. It went from more of an individual contributor mindset of like, oh, I can make a bigger impact, at least for me personally, at scale, if I take on leadership roles and additional responsibility. And so when I started taking that on, when I was at Vivint, we grew an inside sales function from about 50 reps to about 300. And so through that, we went through quite a bit of evolution. And then eventually that company was purchased by Blackstone Group for 2.2 billion. And so after that run, I was kind of left with like, okay, what's the next thing? And there wasn't really anything immediate for me to take on that would be bigger in impact. And so I ran into an old friend of mine who I hadn't seen for 15 years. He's a buddy of mine from Texas. And at this point, like we're both married, have kids. So it's kind of crazy. We randomly run into each other. And he's like, oh, I'm working at this hyper growth company called Qualtrics. We're starting to like really aggressively expand. He's like, you should come take a look. So I went over there, did an interview on site, and just something felt different about Qualtrics. There was this kind of energy, kind of like a palpable energy on the floor. And at the time, they had 300 employees. They just did a Series C for, I think, around 180 million. And we're starting to expand globally. And so I did the interviews and they said, you know what? We don't hire any leaders from outside, especially those that come from more like B2C. And so you're going to have, if you want to join, we'd love to have you join, but you're going to have to come in as like a senior AE. And so I kind of struggle with that for a little bit because I'm like, oh man, the last 5 years, I've kind of built up my career to be like on this leadership track. That's what I want to do. But I also saw the potential in Qualtrics and what it could become. And so, and I also knew I could bet on myself to go and perform for a short time in that role and then be able to go back in leadership. So after talking to my wife, I ended up making that decision. And she's like, you're going to do what now? It seems like you're taking a step back. And I said, no, I promise you, like this company's different. It's unique. And so I ended up going over as a senior AE for about a year, led the department and a lot of the sales there, and then promoted quickly back into sales leadership. And then from there, yeah, like you said, it was a pretty wild ride. Like we ended up growing from 300 employees to roughly 4,200. We blew up and had, I think at the time, 18 or 19 offices globally that we ended up opening. And so it was amazing just to be able to be part of that journey through that evolution of going from 300 hyper growth to, just over 4,000, eventually, like you said, being acquired by SAP for 8 billion. And then 2 years later, spinning out and going and having an IPO for just north of 20 billion. So it was a great time.
Well, the billions just keep stacking up on your resume, right? It goes from 2 to 8 and then to 20. So it means database is on for like a $50 billion
Exactly.
IPO at this point.
If any of our investors are listening, that's exactly right. It's going to be at least 50 billion plus.
That's great. I'd love to hone in. It was very interesting hearing you talk about the kind of take a step back to hopefully take 3 steps forward. I actually did something similar. I was managing the team and took a step back to join Gong and be a rep when I joined earlier last year with kind of the same sort of strategy. And if it seems like looking back on it, that was the right decision for you, yeah.
Yeah, for me, it definitely was. I probably grew 10 times more during the time I was at Qualtrics than anything else. And so I looked at it as an investment, and it definitely paid off. I'm curious for you, what was kind of your reasoning behind being willing to do that?
Yeah, I think it was the same thing. It was kind of like I felt and still do, but I felt just even in the interview process, like this different type of energy at Gong. And I have a friend that initially referred me in. That was a rep, and he was like, dude, like I know you, like you gotta come over here. Like you love sales tech, you have a growth mindset. Like that's what this company's all about. And as soon as I started meeting people, I'm like, this is the spot.
Yeah.
And so, and I asked a few mentors too, and they're like, hey, if you take a step back, I'm 28. It's like you take a step back, you got a lot of time, and hopefully shoot forward. So
Yeah.
that was my thought, and I'm glad I did it. But it's humbling to do that on paper when people see that, and it's like, oh, I don't know if I see the vision, originally. But
Yeah.
you kind of have to just know what's right for you, I think.
Yeah. And I think you almost in a way force yourself to commit and follow through and make sure it happens. Cause like if you do care about the optics of like what that could look like on your resume, you better damn well make sure like you go and perform well doing that, right? Like
Yeah.
if you're gonna make that step back to possibly have a much bigger gain forward, you better go deliver on it. And so for me, it was like a little bit of a higher stakes thing where I'm like, okay, if I'm going to give up what I'm doing now and I'm on a trajectory where I could just stay and maybe a few years later, promote again, and then a few years after that promote, I just wanted something a little bit more aggressive, something that would stretch me a bit. And so you do that. But I mean, you see that all the time nowadays, right? If people get too infatuated with the title too early on in their career, it can actually become an impediment to them in their progress because all they end up looking for is just the title. And so if you're like a VP or CRO on paper too early in your career, you're now kind of in a weird spot. Like, do you only take those types of jobs because of the preservation of the title and the optics of it? Or are you willing to kind of take the step back for maybe a better opportunity?
And don't even get me started on the quote unquote directors of sales that like I see and I'm like, oh shit, like congrats on the role. And I'm like, how many people you manage? And they're like, oh, none. I'm a rep, but I'm a director of rep, director
Yeah.
rep. Like that's not like there's a lot of yeah, a lot of phony
Title
kind of
inflation.
titles. Yeah, title
Yeah.
inflation's a better way to put a more PR way to put it. But yeah, I agree with you. I think if there's a huge difference in being the CRO at Salesforce and being the CRO at a 20-person startup, right? And not that
Yeah.
there's anything wrong with going the startup route, of course, but
Yeah.
I think just understanding where you can go and not being so have the ego tied to the title too early is a great
Yeah.
point.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Let's talk for a few minutes about database. Maybe you could educate the audience a little bit on what you guys are doing, and kind of like where you fit in the market right now.
Yeah, so the origin story of database actually goes back to the Qualtrics days. So as
Okay.
we were experiencing hypergrowth, where we started getting to a point where we were adding multiple sales teams a quarter, it became really hard as a sales organization and for those of us that were in leadership to be able to understand and essentially have visibility into and access to what does the day-to-day productivity look like for the whole sales organization, who are our hardest workers, and who are our hardest workers that maybe aren't succeeding, but they're putting in the effort. So they just maybe need to be trained or developed a little bit more. And that's all that's needed to get them to go hit. Who are the people that are doing both? Like they're both highly skilled and they're working hard. Who are the people that maybe have had success and are letting their foot off the gas a little bit? And the whole approach was to try to develop a system where we could proactively understand those indicators and then address them quickly and then be able to ensure that we were staying on track as an organization to go hit our numbers. I think every single year I was at Qualtrics, it was 50% year over year growth. And that was in the hundreds of millions. And
Hmm.
so it started to become really, really hard to make sure that we were consistently hitting quota every single quarter and every single year. And so we ended up developing kind of a rudimentary version of database there, which was visualizing all of that performance on a quadrant. So you think about like Gartner's Magic Quadrant. It's easy to kind of go see who's leading the pack, who's maybe the up and coming, et cetera. And so we ended up just doing that with the entire sales organization. And so fast forward to now, our global VP of sales, his name is Dan Watkins. He and I worked closely together at Qualtrics and had a really good relationship. Um, the way that we're wired is very similar as well. And so he ended up personally founding and funding Database about a year and a half ago with his brother. His brother Dustin is an engineer, And so we just started taking a lot of that methodology that we had battle tested at Qualtrics to go and achieve hypergrowth, and starting to say, like, let's productize that. Like, let's
Mm,
try to go and actually make a product for sales leaders and sales organizations so that people can perform at their very best, and they can go and understand what are the activities and the skills that if I focus on a daily or weekly basis will lead to me hitting quota. And so the whole idea is to go and take all your CRM data, and database will tie directly into any CRM, and it will use advanced analytics to not only visualize the performance, but it will also help call out areas for improvement. And if improved, what would be the gain in quota attainment for doing such? And
mm,
so it's basic stuff. Like anything that any high performer or person who wants to succeed is probably at some point or another trying to reverse engineer their quota, or
yeah.
trying to understand, hey, what am I good at? What do I need to work on? So that they have a game plan and they have control over their destiny. And database just does all that for you via technology.
I love it. And how many employees roughly do you have nowadays?
Yeah, so I joined last year in May. We had
Yeah.
4. We're now at
Okay.
14. So we just did a seed round. We just closed about 5 months ago for 3 million at
Nice.
a 40 million valuation. And yeah, dude, I for the better part of the last 2 years I was at Qualtrics, I took on a really hairy project, and maybe that's another part of discussion, but it was basically building a startup within Qualtrics.
Mm,
And it was really, really tough the first 9 to 12 months. But afterward, we ended up doing it incredibly well. And so I kind of got that itch to, like, okay, can I go and test myself, and can I go and actually build a company from the ground up? And so that's kind of that, combined with already being very personally invested in the methodology behind database and seeing it work firsthand and helping sales leaders perform really well, is kind of what drew me to database.
that was going to be my next question for people that are listening that are at bigger companies and either considering going to a much smaller startup or have already made that move. I'm curious how that transition was for you. If you had any learning curves, early on to, just lack of systems and lack of resources and time and all those different things. Like, did you feel that pain or maybe not as much?
Oh yeah, I think that is probably the most consistent thing that anybody that will join a startup for the first several years will feel. And there's challenges at every stage of business. When I was at Qualtrics, the challenges weren't access to resources, so to speak. It was more of control of the resources. There's maybe a product marketing team of 15, but there's also a sales organization of 1,000.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of competing ask for those resources. Whereas in startup, it's like, okay, who's going to do the recruiting? Well, I am, because we don't have a recruiting team. Who's going to manage the P&L and L and the finances? Well, I am, because we don't have a finance division yet. And so you become you throw yourself into an environment where you got to be quick and agile and learn things that you probably haven't had to learn before. But that was part of the allure of doing it for me. Was I just wanted to be able to test myself and see, like, okay, I've done well in a hyper growth company like Qualtrics. What am I really made of when I'm, like, left on my own? Like, what can I go and do? And so my wife thinks I'm sick for thinking that way. She's like, things are going so great at Qualtrics, we don't need to leave. But there's just something inside me where, like, I had that desire to go and really push myself and see kind of what I'm made of.
I was talking to a friend about a similar topic sometime over the last few days, and I compared it to, like, it's also nice to, like, lay in your bed and it's nice and warm and comfortable, but, like, the real way to make things happen is, like, to get out, and, like, go out and start the day, even though it's cold outside and whatever, and so I admire your willingness to keep kind of pushing yourself and your boundaries, and you never know what's going to come from it, and what's going to be next by continuing to push your comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean, to use your analogy, like going from a later stage company like Qualtrics to a startup, getting out of that warm bed and taking a cold plunge with chewing on ice every single day, you're just going to be uncomfortable with having to build out a company and go and hiring the right people, and building the culture and all of that. It's all reliant on you. But that's also a pretty big positive, I think. Like, you also are in control, as much control as you probably ever will be, um, by being kind of at the front and center of it. And so it comes with a ton of pressure and responsibility, but there's also a lot of upside to it.
I want to hit you with some rapid fires as we're getting closer to the ending here, if that's
All right.
cool with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we talked about personal development. We're big learners here on this podcast. Curious if there's any books that you look, whether it was early in your sales career or now as a leader. They could be business focused. They could be a totally different genre. But any books, if you are a book reader, that have stood out to you in your career.
So early on, anything that was Brian Tracy, which might date me a little bit.
Yeah,
Grant Cardone is probably a little bit more of like a modern day version of that. The basics for me were the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I read that in
yep,
college. There's another one, Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. That was just kind
yep.
of like the basic inner workings of working with people. Those were pretty foundational for me. The Art of Closing was another one early on. And then from there, I kind of evolved more into, at once I got into leadership, it was a lot of like leadership books. Like, okay, how do I go build a culture of high accountability, but also fun and where people succeed? Like, I want to have branding of like, if you come work for me, I'm going to bet on you and help you have the most success you've ever had in your career. And so trying to go and learn more of those things. And so that started to lead to, there's books out there by like Peter Drucker. I wouldn't, I'm always reading. And so I don't think there's any one book that kind of stands out as like, oh, that was the most pivotal one. But I think there's just something about, committing yourself to continual learning. And so I would say something I've really enjoyed the last year or so is listening to a podcast called SaaStr.
Hmm.
Um, and obviously the Pavilion Podcast as
Yeah,
well.
of
People,
course.
we got to do a plug there. But I would say I've really enjoyed SaaStr as well because they interview a lot of business leaders who've gone through various stages of building a company, and they just share kind of their experience and what's going on, kind of similar to what you're doing here as well. So I just
Yeah,
like hearing people's stories and what they've gone through, and how they've come out of it and what they've learned.
yeah, their stuff is great, and Jason Lemkin's articles and tweets and
Yeah.
everything have helped me learn that world quite a bit.
And that,
Um,
I just realized that's a rapid fire question, but a long answer. So hit me
that's
with
how
the
they
next
usually go.
one.
I call it rapid fire, but it's usually like the longest segment of the whole podcast. So maybe I need to change the branding on that. So anything I was going to ask you about podcasts, anything else that you either listen to or if you tune into like newsletters or people on LinkedIn you follow, anything like that outside of like books or other kind of cheat sheets that you'd want to reference that have helped you out?
A newsletter I really like is CB Insights.
Okay.
And that's just kind of all things business. And then for startup frameworks, I really like Michael Scott's his content. You can find a lot of it actually on YouTube. He's a kind of a serial entrepreneur who's turned to Harvard professor, and he teaches a lot about how to establish go-to-market frameworks that kind of help us scale, especially for startups as well. So Michael Skok, SKOK, he's got some good stuff as well.
I've got some friends over at CB Insights, actually a former podcast guest. So he'll be happy to hear that you like the newsletter.
Yeah, been a long time fan.
What's going on in the Nate Richard Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you're listening to tunes? Like, what's going on in the headphones?
So I try to listen to some things that are non-sales or non-business related as well. And recently, I've never been a big runner or anything, but I set a goal last year that within 3 years I wanted to run an ultra marathon. And so this is year 2 of this. And so I'm doing marathons this year. Last year I did some trail half marathons, doing marathons this year in kind of preparation to do a 50-mile next year. And so I've been listening a lot to, there's a podcast called 80/20 Endurance. And it just goes through kind of the different training modalities and kind of the biology behind how to go and train for long distance running. So that's been kind of on repeat quite a bit in my car driving to and from. I'm also listening to a book right now called The Sales Acceleration Formula, which
Yeah.
is also really, really good. It kind of goes through the early stages of a company, uh, what founders and kind of early leaders would experience, and for good or bad, and then kind of how to go build a company that will last. So those are the two things on repeat right now.
Okay. I'd recommend, I'm also a runner in like endurance sports and all that, Spartan races and all that stuff. I'd recommend checking out Rich Roll on his podcast if you
All
haven't
right.
heard of him. He's
I
a
have.
former. Okay.
Oh, I have. Yeah. I listened to one a few months back. He interviewed Courtney Dauwalter, who did the
Yeah,
Moab
she's a
240
beast.
in like, I can't remember she did the Moab 240-mile race in like 38 hours or something. The next closest guy was 10 hours away. So I enjoyed that podcast. He's a great podcaster.
She's crazy, wild. As a side note, I actually have a different podcast that I run and interviewed her like years ago after she was on Joe Rogan, and she was saying the same thing. She was like hallucinating on the trail and just kept running and just insanity. But that's another story for another day. A quick plug for database. Are you guys hiring? If so, like what are roles that are top of mind if people are listening and like your story?
Yeah, so we've got most of the functions hired out for now. I am always looking to connect. I think recruiting's a long-term game. And so there's definitely going to be additional roles that we're looking to hire for in the future. The only two that I've got left for this month, this is the end of our fiscal quarter, is I need a pretty senior enterprise field sales rep to add to our sales team. And then also um, kind of a mid to senior account executive. And so right around 5 to 7 years of experience. So I am looking for those. And then also we're looking for a customer support rep as well. But other than that, we've done a pretty good job getting all our hiring done. And we've got some great people at the company. But yeah, shameless plug. If you're interested to come join a great startup in Utah with a great team, great culture, and a great market opportunity, database is a great place to be.
If anyone listening is one of those people, would your LinkedIn be the best place to go, or careers page, or where would you send people?
Yeah, just LinkedIn. Yeah, I'm on there every single day in terms of recruiting, and so send me a message, and I'd love to connect.
Cool. All right, last question for you, Nate. Who else that's in your network or that you work with should come on the Pavilion podcast next?
Oh, so definitely our founder Dan Watkins. He was an employee at Qualtrics. I think I always forget the number, 8, somewhere around there. And he was pretty instrumental in building it to what it became. I would say David Bywater is just a super well-rounded leader. I rubbed shoulders with him a little bit when I was at Vivint. He went on to be, I believe, the president of Vivint Solar, and then he's come back to Vivint, which is a different company that does all the home automation. I believe he's their CEO now. David Bywater would also be great. Who else? Those two guys, definitely. There's also another guy named John DeAgostino, who I've worked with. He was our VP of Enterprise Sales at Qualtrics, and he's retired now, but overall a great guy with tons of wisdom. I think he started his sales career doing printer selling or something old school like that, and just kind of worked his way all the way up through SaaS. And so, yeah, those 3 guys would be a great time to have on.
Did they ask for referrals at the end of the home security? Because that was the Cutco bread and butter, and I just got you on 3 right there.
You know what? I feel like B2C sales is all about that name dropping, asking for the referrals. Yeah, absolutely. The more you could talk to someone who knew somebody else, the higher the chance would be to sell that. So
That's awesome. Well, Nate, I appreciate you coming on, man. I loved hearing your story. Wishing you guys nothing but good things in 2022. And for everyone else, we'll be back next week with another episode. But definitely check out Nate on LinkedIn. Hit him up if you have questions or want to connect. So thanks, Nate.
thanks, Tom. I loved it.
Thanks for checking out that episode. Happy January, start of the year. Let's kick some ass. Again, one of my goals for this show is to get as many subscribers wherever you're listening here on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Subscribe, leave a review, and then hit me up on LinkedIn, Tom Malemo, or any of my other socials at Tommy Tahoe. Look forward to connecting with you there. Peace.